This is the Metaspeed Edge Tokyo, and it looks almost identical to the Metaspeed Sky Tokyo that I reviewed last week. But of all the years that ASICS has had both an Edge and a Sky version of Metaspeed, this is the year where the differences are perhaps the most distinct. Yet, it's also the year where more people will probably be able to run in either one. Let's try and make sense of it all. It's time to lace up the Metaspeed Edge Tokyo and take it for a run. Yo, what's going on? My name is Kofuzi and I'm a non-elite runner who reviews running shoes here on YouTube. And today I want to talk to you guys all about the ASICS Metaspeed Edge Tokyo. But before I give you my thoughts on this shoe, I do want to go over some disclosures. This is a pair of shoes that ASICS sent to me for the purpose of review, so I did not have to pay for these shoes. However, nobody's paying me to make this video or to include their brand in this video, and no one's going to get a chance to preview any of my footage or my thoughts before you guys get a chance to see this video on YouTube. So with that disclosure out of the way, let's talk about the Metaspeed Edge Tokyo, and let's start with the specs. This is a 39.5 millimeter stack height shoe with a 5 millimeter drop, giving us 34.5 millimeters of stack height in the forefoot. And in this midsole, we have three different components. We've got FF Turbo Plus, that's the bottom layer here, and that's made out of Puma. It's the same racing foam that we saw last year in the Metaspeed series. Then we have a carbon fiber plate that starts high up in the heel and then scoops down low into the forefoot, which has been a signature feature of the Metaspeed Edge series over the years. And then on the top layer, that's where we have ASICS' newness. It's the FF Leap. It's an aliphatic TPU layer, and the way that they're using it here, that aliphatic TPU is really airy, it's really squishy, it's really light, and it's also really responsive. All the kinds of words that I love to hear put together when I'm talking about racing foams. Now on the outsole, we have a pattern that's very similar to what we've seen in both prior Metaspeed Edge years, but also in Metaspeed Sky. And one of the ways that you can differentiate between those two shoes is that the Metaspeed Edge has black rubber on the outsole and the Metaspeed Sky has red rubber on the outsole. And the other little way that you can notice the difference between these two shoes, if the very drastic color differences didn't do it for you, is the way that there are special cutouts on the shoe which emphasize kind of where the first impact is intended to be or is planned for in this shoe. In the Metaspeed Sky Tokyo, there's an extra cutout in the forefoot which is intended to leave more room for the foams to expand on that first impact when you're taking a lot of force. But on the Metaspeed Edge Tokyo, you see it in the back on the lateral here. There's an extra cutout on the rubber strip towards the back. There also is a lot of exposed foam on this shoe as well in an effort to help keep weight down, and the rubber that we do have is pretty thin, just like I would expect to see in any race shoe. Moving to the upper, we have Motion Wrap 3.0, which is the similar type of material that we saw in the Metaspeed Sky Tokyo that I reviewed last week. The updates that I really enjoy is that there is this band going across the top of the foot, which I think not only looks great, but also provides a nice element of structure to the toe box. And I'm feeling like there is a very consistent amount of toe box height in the forefoot of the shoe, which makes for a much more comfortable fit. And there's a lot of volume in the midfoot as well. So it's a much more roomy shoe than the prior Metaspeed Edges that I've encountered. The laces that they're using are those wavy, curly type of laces, which I enjoy seeing in race product because once you tie those laces, they are not going to get untied. The tongue is nice and very thin. It lays on top of the foot nice and easy, protects you from the pressure from the laces, but it otherwise doesn't add weight. It doesn't add too much sweat sponge in terms of foam padding, and it just stays out of the way. And altogether, this shoe comes in as one of the lighter shoes that's on the market today for racing, coming in at the same weight as its fraternal twin at 5.9 ounces and 170 grams. Now that we talked about what this shoe is like on paper, let's talk about what it's like when you're on the road. Now, I think that I first have to start out by explaining that I am not the target audience for whom the Metaspeed Edge is developed. I'm more of a Metaspeed Sky runner, and to kind of oversimplify things, I think the easiest way to think about whether you're a Sky runner or an Edge runner is to think about whether you're a forefoot striker or a heel striker. I'm more of a forefoot striker, especially at marathon speeds. I'm in the midfoot to forefoot, and I'm not in the heel, so this shoe isn't really designed for me. And in prior years, the Metaspeed Edge has been pretty uncomfortable of a shoe to run in, even though it looks almost identical every year to one of my favorite shoes every year, the Metaspeed Sky. And so the Edge is always kind of one of those weird tricks of the eye where it looks like I'm gonna love it, but I end up really not getting along with it. At slower speeds, I feel like it's poking me up in the arch. And even at faster speeds, at kind of race intended speeds or faster, I feel like it's always wanting me to chop my stride, because I think one of the kind of main features of the Edge is that it's specifically designed for heel strikers and other runners who have very quick turnover, which is not a way that I would describe myself. And so the only way that I've really gotten along well with the Metaspeed Edge in prior generations is that I've been using it for really fast work, at least really fast work relatively speaking for me, and that means like VO2 max work or faster. I recently raced in the Metaspeed Edge Paris, a 5K when I was in Tokyo for the product launch media event for the Tokyo series, and that shoe was really fun for me to race in for 5K. And anything much longer than that, the way that the shoe disagrees with me starts to become a bigger and bigger issue. This year, I feel like the FF Leap does a lot to make the experience more enjoyable, even for people for whom the shoe isn't specifically designed. And so I'm also enjoying the Metaspeed Edge Tokyo this year, even though in prior years I've been able to tolerate it in really short bursts. This year, I'm still feeling like it's designed for a heel striker. It still feels like the arch is kind of protruding up into my heel a little bit too much, and it still feels like it wants me to chop my stride. But to the extent that this shoe disagrees with me, it's disagreeing with me less. And I think a big reason for that is the FF Leap foam that's in here. So even when I am landing either on the heel of the shoe, as the shoe is kind of intended, I'm still able to get a really nice squish in that forefoot as I'm rolling forward, or even when I'm landing directly on the forefoot, which is kind of more natural for me, I'm still getting a really nice sense of compression and decompression from that FF Leap foam. I'm not exactly using it as it's intended, but I'm still getting a lot of good out of it nevertheless, if that makes sense. And I think that for the people for whom this shoe is intended, those heel strikers out there, those people who have been loving the Metaspeed Edge over the past several years, I think that there's going to be a lot to love for you guys as well. Again, because of that FF Leap, I think that when you do hit the ground on the heel, you're going to be able to roll through really easily because that foam squishes nicely. And then as your foot is leaving the ground into that next stride, it's going to decompress with a nice amount of pop, pushing you forward into that next stride. It's also a lighter shoe than it's ever been, while still maintaining that geometry that lends itself to that really fast turnover and that foot strike position that has been working well for Edge lovers since the beginning of the series. Now, this is the part of the video where I normally like to zoom out and see where a shoe fits within a broader lineup within a brand. Now, I just reviewed the Metaspeed Sky Tokyo last week, so I just did a breakdown of the entire ASICS lineup. So instead, what I want to do here is talk about the Metaspeed Edge and the Metaspeed Sky, talk about the things that are different and which levers ASICS is pulling on or pushing on in order to make a shoe a heel striker shoe or a forefoot striker shoe. And then we're going to apply those same parameters to the rest of the industry to see how they're tinkering with their shoes to deliver different experiences. First, let's start with how these two shoes are different. We've already been talking a lot about the high plate position and the low plate position, or the scooped plate position that we see in the Edge. We also talked a lot about the rocker starting position and the amount of taper that the shoes have at the toes. The thing that's interesting about the Edge, though, is that there's less of an aggressive heel striker kind of geometry at the forefoot of the shoe, especially compared to prior versions of the Metaspeed Edge. And I think that's probably why more people than ever are going to be able to run in the Metaspeed Edge, because of the fact that it's less aggressively heel striker and it's more kind of in the heel striker / midfoot category. But the other thing that they're also tinkering around with here is the foams. Yes, they both have FF Turbo Plus and FF Leap, but the orientation of the foams is inverted. And so in the Metaspeed Sky, you have the denser foam up top and then more of the soft foam on the bottom. And the idea is that you have more of that dense stuff close to your foot when you're landing directly in the forefoot. And then they flipped it for for the Metaspeed Edge, where you have the dense stuff, the FF Turbo Plus, in the heel of the shoe, and you're landing directly on that, and you have that as your more impact resilient area in the back of the shoe, and then you're rolling forward onto the softer FF Leap Plus. The other things that they're doing with this shoe is they're putting different plates in these two shoes as well. Now, I'm not positive that they did it with the Metaspeed Paris versions, but they're definitely doing it with these versions here in Tokyo. I had a chance to look at the plates themselves. The Metaspeed Sky Tokyo has a plate that's wider in the forefoot, and that's to better distribute impact forces when you are forefoot striking. And that's in addition to the different plate positions that these two shoes have. So I think that's all the main categories of differences that I want to talk about for these two shoes. And let's start talking about what the rest of the industry is doing. Now, I think that the first other brand that I want to talk about has got to be Puma. So let's take a look at their two shoes. We have the Fast R3 and the Deviate Nitro Elite 3. And these two shoes fall into a very similar pattern. We have here a plate position that starts high in the heel and then slams down into the forefoot. On the Fast R3, we do have a plate position that's pretty aggressive. It starts out high and gets really low to the forefoot. And we have a rocker position that starts a little bit earlier and would visually indicate to me that this is maybe more of a midfoot striker shoe. But when we take a look at the bottom of the shoe, whenever I see kind of a decoupled forefoot and heel, I'm instantly thinking that the forefoot of the shoe is intended to be a giant like landing pad for you to bounce on top of. And this really meager, tiny heel in the back definitely tells me that this is not intended to take the forces of a heel striker. And so this to me is kind of a midfoot striker's geometry in a forefoot striker's package here, while the Nitro Elite 3 is more squarely in that wedge shape where the foam starts out high in the back, the plate starts high in the back, and everything slams down towards the front of the arch, and then you're rolling onto that forefoot. Another brand that's doing something very similar is Nike. And for this one, for visuals purposes, I'm going to use some older models of the Alphafly and the Vaporfly. Now the Alphafly has, again, we're seeing a decoupled in a way forefoot and heel. We've got a giant landing pad of foam in the forefoot and then a very slender heel in the back, showing you that you're not really intended to be doing some heel striking, although it kind of flares in the back. So heel strikers were able to get along quite well with this one. And then with the Vaporfly 3 particularly, we have, again, that wedge that slams down towards the arch, and then you roll onto the forefoot. The plate position also starts really high and then scoops down very low. The other thing that Nike is doing with these two shoes is they're playing around with the foams. Yes, they do have Zoom X, but we have the air zoom pockets in the front of the Alphafly, which is one of the more unique things about it. But if you think about it, these are two different foams they're using. And because of the size of the air zoom units, the plate position has to stay kind of high in the Alphafly. So I feel like the Alphafly is more of the forefoot stomper shoe, and the Vaporfly 3 is more of the heel striker shoe. And I feel like these are the three brands that I think that are doing this pattern of forefoot striker shoe and heel striker shoe the most distinctly. A lot of other brands are doing it, but they start to kind of mix things up a little bit. Let's take a look at the three stripes. Now, again, I'm going to use some older model shoes for demonstrative purposes. Now, I'm looking here now at the Adios Pro 3. Again, we have somewhat of a decoupled forefoot and heel. It's really thin in the back of the heel. We've got a giant landing pad of foam to stomp on in the forefoot. And then in the Adios Pro Evo, at least version 1, we had a very different rocker that started very early and tapered extremely aggressively. So you had, relatively speaking, a lot less foam as you got into the pads of the foot and into the toe box. And so the difference that I felt with these two shoes is that the Adios Pro 3 definitely felt like a forefoot stomper shoe, and the Evo 1 didn't exactly feel like a heel striker shoe, but it felt more to me like it was a midfoot striker shoe. Next, let's talk about Saucony. Saucony also has two different kinds of race shoes, the Endorphin Elite, this is Endorphin Elite 2, and the Endorphin Pro version 4. I think with the Elite 2, we have again a decoupled forefoot and heel. We have a giant landing pad of foam in the forefoot for you to stomp on, and they're playing with different kinds of foam here. We've got Incredi-Run in this shoe. They are trying to make it a little bit more stable in the back by giving you this wide flare, and I feel like for the Endorphin Elite series, they've been trying to not make it so distinctly a forefoot striker shoe. They've been putting forefoot striker elements in it and heel striker elements in it, and kind of made a midfoot striker shoe in the process. But this rocker position doesn't feel like it starts quite as early as a pure midfoot striker shoe, and then it shoots up really quickly, which to me feels more like something you would put in a forefoot striker shoe. In the Endorphin Pro 4, now I don't think this shoe has always been a heel striker shoe, and I still don't think it's purely a heel striker shoe, but I think with what they're doing in the back of the shoe, they give it this like kind of trapezoidal shape, which to me is kind of an elbows out move to make it super stout so it won't tip over if you're landing in the heel. And then the plate position does scoop down relatively low. We're also using a different foam in this shoe compared to what we're seeing in the Endorphin Elite to control the experience a little bit more. And I feel like here, even though there is a lot of foam, I feel like you're getting a lot of the dynamics in the back of the shoe and the intent that you would roll forward into the next foot strike. And then the last brand that I do want to talk about is Hoka. They also have two very different kinds of shoe. Again, we have somewhat of a decoupled forefoot and heel, and here we got a really big landing pad for you to stomp on. And this shoe is kind of more of a midfoot striker shoe in my mind, although it kind of pulls a lot of elements of forefoot striker shoe and heel striker shoe. It has an aggressive plate position. It starts up high in the heel and then scoops down really low. And then we have an early rocker with an aggressive taper in the forefoot, and those things kind of shout out midfoot or heel striker shoe. But this plate is forked, and it's not really a full length carbon fiber plate. It doesn't really go all the way to the back. So the plate position isn't as determining of a factor in this shoe for me. That feels primarily like a midfoot striker shoe, but it does have some forefoot striker elements to it. And again, the heel back here is an aggressive bevel, and so it shows me that I'm not sure that you're really intended to be stomping and hitting the back of this shoe as the primary point of impact. Whereas on the Rocket X2, we've got that trapezoidal shape that indicates that it's kind of girded or beefed up back here so that you can be landing on the heel, and we have a very aggressive plate position. Now the rocker positions on both of these shoes are relatively similar, and the amount of foam that's in the forefoot, given the tapers of these shoes at the forefoot, I think is more foam in the Rocket X2 than in the Cielo X1 2.0. So I feel like these two shoes are good examples of like simply putting certain paper specs and dimensions and parameters into the shoe doesn't necessarily always define the kind of ride or the kind of runner that's going to appreciate the rides that each of these shoes do provide. But I think that overall, what we're seeing here is that brands are putting together two equivalent types of shoes. Some are choosing to make them look similar, and some are choosing to make them look very different. But we're seeing two different types of shoes that are both intended for the marathon distance, but they're very different and intended to target different runners. Now let's wrap up the video by going over the buying guide, and we'll also discuss some alternatives. The Metaspeed Sky has historically been the more popular of the two Metaspeed options. There's more people that respond well to the Sky than respond well to the Edge. But if you've historically gone back and forth as to which one is the right one for you, I feel like for you guys, this year's Edge is going to be the most compelling Metaspeed Edge yet. The Alphafly does wonders for this shoe. It makes it more cushioned, it makes it more springy, but it also makes it more lightweight. Now, this shoe is going to retail at $270, and I really wish that ASICS could have kept on to that $250 price point that we've previously had for the Metaspeed Sky and the Metaspeed Edge, but this shoe doesn't release until late July, so let's see if the reason for that price increase holds or if maybe it chickens out. In the meantime, I would say that you should take a look at the Metaspeed Edge Paris. It has a lot of the same ride mechanics, and it's currently available now, so if you need something for a race this summer before the Tokyo releases, I think that's probably going to be the best nearest alternative, and it's a shoe that I think you're going to enjoy. But let's also take a look at some of the alternatives that are out there to see where the competition stacks up. Now, when it comes to shoes that I think that are designed for heel strikers, the number one shoe that I think about is from Puma, and that's the Deviate Nitro Elite 3. This was my #1 marathon racing shoe of last year. Again, even though I'm not necessarily the target audience for that shoe, I just think that that shoe was both that good for heel strikers and still had appeal for non-heel strikers as well. The aliphatic TPU that's in that shoe is a lot more dense and a lot springier than the FF Leap that's in the Metaspeed Edge and in the Metaspeed Sky, but it's also a little bit less cushioned. It does still retain a lot of that lightweight goodness though, and that shoe comes in at $230, so quite a bit cheaper than the Metaspeed Edge Tokyo. The main difference I think between these two lightweight aliphatic TPU, at least or partial aliphatic TPU in the case of the Metaspeed Edge, is going to come down to how much cushion you're getting in that forefoot. I feel like the wedge-shaped design that's in the Nitro Elite 3 pretty much makes it feel like the foam almost stops at the pads of your foot and you're pushing off from the ground. Even though there is a lot of stack height here, it feels very firm and very flat in the forefoot, while I feel like the Edge Tokyo and its FF Leap in the forefoot gives you a nice sense of cushion in that forefoot, in addition to a solid wedge-shaped design that's going to work well for heel strikers. And the other shoe that I think we should take a look at is from Nike, and that's the Vaporfly version 4. Now, typically when talking about the Nitro Elite 3 from Puma, I like to compare that to the Vaporfly version 3, but I think here the Vaporfly 4 is the better comparison point, because I think year over year, the Vaporfly and the Metaspeed Edge underwent similar transitions where they're both still definitely intended for heel strikers, but the changes from year over year made it, I think, a little bit more palatable to forefoot strikers, and maybe the option that I push people towards if they're in that midfoot, or I don't know what I am, or I'm not sure which one of these two I might prefer in the case of the Edge versus Sky, or in Nike's case, the Vaporfly versus the Alphafly. And so I think that both of these shoes have a lot of similar things going for them. They have a lot of PBA in the heel, plate positions that start up high in the back and then aggressively swoop down underneath the pads of the foot and are designed to roll forward on the push off. While I do think that the Vaporfly 4 is softer in the forefoot than the Nitro Elite 3, it's not as soft in the forefoot as the Metaspeed Edge Tokyo is, and that's one way that I would decide between those shoes. And the Vaporfly 4 also comes in at $270. So those are my thoughts on the Metaspeed Edge Tokyo. I think more people are going to like the Edge this year than ever. Hopefully retailers are now starting to stock both the Sky and Edge, so you guys can actually go and try each of these shoes on for yourself rather than just having to take my word for it. If you do have the opportunity to do that, put that in the comments down below and let me know which retailers are stocking both. I'd love to kind of get that kind of on the ground feedback from across the country and across the world, wherever you guys are. If you have any questions about any of the shoes that I talked about today, feel free to put them in the comments down below, or better yet, stop by the live stream that I do Mondays and Thursdays over on the Kofuzi Run Club channel. I'd love to see you guys over there in the chat. That's all I have for today, everybody. Thanks so much for making it all the way to the end of this video. Hopefully you guys are staying safe out there on your runs, and I will see you in the next one.
Yo, what's going on?